Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for Justice Talks, presented by the General Board of Church and Society of the United Methodist Church. I'm your host, Jeff Corey. As we continue to seek justice and pursue peace, my guests and I will explore today's topic, activating hope through advocacy and faithful engagement. Our format is simple. We plan to have a conversation about advocacy that connects our faith with difficult issues in society. And as you view, please ask questions through the chat, which we'll answer later in the conversation. Well, we all know seeking justice and pursuing peace through advocacy is not easy. Currently, we face a threatened democracy, undefeated racism, immeasurable violence, climate change denial, grave economic injustices, undying voter suppression, endless conflict on reproductive health and women's rights, shocking public health disparities, and a profoundly divided country and world without peace. In today's seemingly constant conflict, how do we overcome activist fatigue? And is it really possible to activate hope through advocacy? Well, fortunately, I have subject matter experts with me today who know a lot about advocacy and generating hope. If you tuned in to previous Justice Talks, I'm sure you've recognized the Reverend Dr. Susan Henry Crow, General Secretary for the General Board of Church and Society. Also with us today are three new faces to the General Board of Church and Society. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Holly Metcalf, who is our new Director of Peace with Justice. She is responsible for advocacy efforts on peace building, conflict resolution, disarmament and non-proliferation, and gun violence prevention. Next, the Reverend Camille Henderson Edwards is our new Director of Economic Health and Gender Justice, where she is responsible for legislative and policy advocacy in all three areas. Last but not least is the Reverend Kendall McBroom, who is our new director responsible for managing and developing legislative and policy advocacy for civil and human rights. Thank you all for being here today. And now I'd like to pass it over to Susan and get her thoughts on advocacy, hope, and faithful engagement during these challenging times.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, colleagues. It's wonderful to be with all of you today, and we really appreciate you joining this Justice Talk. For the past few weeks, I've been reflecting on what are our theological and biblical underpinnings for this particular season. Today, we are talking about human suffering and ways that we as people of faith respond. We are all feeling world weary and beleaguered. We're surrounded by woundedness, brokenness, pain, and death. Our cities, our countries, and our communities are broken. I have found solace and inspiration in at least two books I want to mention today. One is the Bible, and the other is a book written by a friend of mine, Dr. Kathleen O'Connor, who is a scholar of Hebrew scripture entitled Lamentations and the Tears of the World. She discusses prayer as truthfulness and lamentation as a work of justice. Our days are filled with prayer and lamentation to such deep pain. Dr. O'Connor goes on to discuss Isaiah and Jeremiah and others' witness to a word from the Lord of how mourning can be turned into dancing and sorrow into joy. We are in a time of lamentation with God as our inspiration and our hope. The work of church and society originates out of suffering, the suffering of the peoples of the world. The church is called to address suffering in very intentional ways. In addition, the vision of right relationship with God and neighbor throughout society and all aspects of life is our Methodist heritage and calling for social holiness. Today, we are discussing suffering caused by violence, war, guns, and disrespecting and harming women and their right to health care. Holly, Camille, and Kendall, and our board member, Reverend Timon Stigger, offer reflections on our work and challenge us to think prayerfully and theologically as we are motivated for justice, which is our witness. The work of church and society is to address causes of violence of many kinds. We must listen, hear, accompany, and give witness to and lament the pain of the world. We are called to mirror, hear, stand with those who suffer. And we must say, yes, there is great suffering. Our priorities of peace, poverty, health, immigration, and climate through an anti-racist and anti-colonial lens is what we do. This means we hear and hold the pain of women suffering because of attacks on their right to health care with no place to go. And we hold the tears and the heartbreak of families losing children to needless gun violence. And we hold the stories of war and its myriad atrocities. Also, we are witnessing to God's grace and to the Holy Spirit. We're all standing in the mercy and grace of God. We are so glad when policies and laws come closer to making the society and the world a better place. And our ultimate goal is to help witness to the truth and love of God, to the love of God and neighbor. The rest of our ministry is to inspire people to walk in the ways that alleviate pain in the world. Inspire, as you know, means to breathe. God breathes life into brokenness. As we hear and accompany God's people, we are motivated and called to act, to organize, to muster our imagination and resources to alleviate suffering. We know that suffering is not the last word. In Isaiah and Jeremiah, the Psalms and Revelation, God promises to rebuild the shattered cities, the broken hearts and wounded creation with precious things, more beautiful than we can even imagine, where children flourish, where oppression and violence do not have the last word, and where fear is put far, far away. We hear these promises throughout Scripture. God has brought comfort to Zion and set in motion a new future. Mourning is turning into dancing, and sorrow is turning into joy. And new members of the GBCS staff give new energy and new life and new voice into the wondrous witness of love and grace and justice. So now I'd like to introduce the work that we are continuing in these areas with Holly.
So Holly, what I'd like to do, if it's okay with you, is I'd like to start with a quick question that's in your wheelhouse. What are your thoughts on the development around gun violence prevention, and how do we as United Methodists reconcile the Supreme Court's recent decision to overturn New York's concealed gun law with the most sweeping gun control bill in decades that was just signed into law by President Biden?
Thanks, Jeff. I think, as you've named, we saw two developments last week that seem to embrace opposing worldviews, right? You have the Supreme Court decision in New York versus Bruin, which embraces this worldview that seems to believe that the answer to living in a violent world, the violent world that we live in, is to have more weapons, to protect yourself with weapons. Whereas the answer that we see in the legislation that was signed into law over the weekend is focused on removing access to those weapons in our country and making sure that people who are having mental health crises or have a history of violence don't have access to those weapons. And so that legislation included a lot of the specific actions that we've been advocating for based on our social principles. And I think it just reminds us that it may seem contradictory in this moment. It may seem like they're two opposing viewpoints, but I think what we're seeing is America grappling very publicly with what does it mean to live in a violent world. And I think it reminds us that when we read these scriptural passages about nonviolence, they were controversial in Jesus's time because it is not the way of the world. And so when we advocate nonviolence as Christians, it is only natural that there is going to be push and pull. There's going to be movement forward and what feels like setbacks at different times. So I want to give a little context, if I can, to the situation in America, because violence has been a problem, for millennia. And it is a worldwide problem. But the problem of gun violence in America is particular to our context and our time. And so I just want to give a little bit of statistics as we dig deeper into this conversation. So in America, every day, an average of 321 people are shot. And of those people, 111 of them die from their wounds. Black Americans in America are 14 times more likely to be shot than white Americans. And every day, every 16 hours, a woman in America is shot dead by her partner or her former partner. And so while we see mass shootings on TV, and we know that mass shootings are becoming more common in America, we're up to an average of 2 mass shootings per day. The vast majority of people that are injured in our country by gun violence are not injured in mass shootings. And the vast majority of people that are impacted by this, it disproportionately affects communities of color and women in our country.
Thank you, Holly. That's an interesting perspective. And I wanted to get Kendall in this because you brought up an interesting point as it relates to racism and how it connects to gun violence. Also, part of this gun law funding relates to mental health funding. So Kendall, can you give us a sense of or a bit of your perspective around the intersection of gun violence with racism, mental and public health?
Absolutely. Thank you, Jeff. And Holly, thank you for setting that up and in your points with the statistics, because there is, from those statistics, if you just look at them at face value, there are myths that come along with that, myths that have inherently been a part of American culture, and then those myths then create these false narratives. And one of those false narratives is that communities of color are simply more violent, that they are more prone to violence, more prone to these type of activities and gun violence per se, specifically. However, what that myth fails to do is realize the root causes that are taking place in those communities. Lack of funding for education, lack of affordable housing, redlining, a federal program, if you will, that was played out in many different neighborhoods and states that really divested and took away resources from communities of color, Black communities specifically. And so with that being said, that's the intersection of where gun violence, why there is more gun violence or higher levels of gun violence in Black and brown and communities of color than we see in other communities. So we want to make sure that is well known. And then as it relates to mental health, my colleague mentioned this earlier when we were discussing and going through programming. about how mental health, even that conversation about around mental health, is needed and necessary. However, when it has a particular look whenever we discuss this individual having a mental health crisis or a mental health issue versus the accountability that needs to go along with the action and the act as well. So we want to make sure that we hold that close. And notice that distinction of when mental health is presented to the program, when mental health is brought into the conversation, and how it's brought into the conversation. We also have to think about the impact, knowing that statistics, gun violence is actually the leading cause of death for our youth, for children. And so what harm does that do to them mentally, the trauma that you have to, imagining the trauma and knowing the trauma that our youth are going through, having to live in a violent world, in a world where guns have a lot of rights, and gun owners have a lot of rights in that sense. So we want to think about that. And then also the increase in suicide and who that affects and how that hits Black and brown communities higher by using that choice of weapon and having access to those weapons throughout our nation and throughout our world.
Thanks, Kendall. Is there any connection to racism in guns, the whole aspect of racially motivated violence? Can you talk to that a little bit?
So yeah, absolutely. So just making sure I understand the question, the correlation between racism and racially motivated acts of violence.
Correct.
I think so. And I believe that goes into a number of ideologies that have been spewed or that have been spoken and that have been spread, particularly as we take, for example, a more recent example, the Buffalo shooting, the shooting that took place in Buffalo, where a young man went gunned down, went to a specific grocery store, targeted a specific type of people because of a message that he had heard regarding being replaced. We also know of course, Dylan Roof, who went to Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston and shot up a church for the same reason, similar reasoning of not wanting to be replaced and feeling as though these communities were a threat to their way of life. So there's absolutely an ideology that's linked to this racist practice, these racist actions, and then compound that with having access to these weapons, having access to these firearms, makes those all the more a reality.
Thank you. So do you see reasons to be hopeful? Holly mentioned how advocates played a role in getting the legislation passed for gun control. Maybe you can share a little bit about your hopeful views in light of what's going on around guns.
I absolutely think the signing of this bill last weekend was an area for hope. And I believe that was born out of the actions that citizens of this country took in the weeks and months leading up to the passage of that legislation. I think that it is easy to get disheartened and to feel like this is a problem we can't solve. This is an insurmountable problem. There's nothing we can do. And it certainly is difficult, but I like to remind folks that this is a human problem. We created this problem, and we created it, at least with school shootings, in my lifetime. I'm old enough to remember a time when you didn't learn run, hide, fight in elementary school. And so we have made this problem and we can unmake it. And I think the progress we made over the weekend is evidence of that. And we are called to unmake it, to partner with God in changing this world for the better. I think we often quote Dr. Martin Luther King about the arc of the moral universe bending towards justice, but we forget that sermon that he gave is about how it is the responsibility of Christians to bend that arc. It doesn't naturally bend on its own. And so I see hope in the efforts that have been taken on this issue, the ways we are making small progress, and the ways people are connecting to be active.
Yeah, I see that hope also in local programs as well as national programs, buyback programs, buying guns off, taking guns off the street, illegal guns, illegal firearms off of the street, and how communities when are saying, we're tired of it. Local folk are saying we're tired of this being our reality. And also I see hope in addressing the root causes. I think when we address the root causes of why these acts are taking place, be it nationally, racially motivated, why is the replacement theory something that has gained so much attention and so much energy? Why has there been so much energy around that? I think when we address those root causes of that, that's where I glean hope from.
Great, thanks for your comment. Anybody else want to comment on hope? You're saving it to the end. Another issue that's on all our minds is reproductive health and women's rights. And as United Methodists, how do we respond to that decision made by the Supreme Court to overturn Roe v. Wade last Friday? Camille, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, thank you, Jeff, for this question. I think I'd first like to start with just a general overview of what has happened. So we know that, as you said, on this past Friday, the United States Supreme Court ruled in the case of Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization that the Constitution does not grant rights to an abortion and overruled Roe v. Wade. And I also think that it's important to note that this ruling is situated against the backdrop of years of fighting for the human rights of women and girls, including Roe v. Wade when it was first established in 1973. And so just about 50 years later, the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe now threatens access to care for so many in this country. And if we are to examine this through the lens of race, right, as is our commitment to anti-racist policies, then it becomes undoubtedly clear that what is truly at risk are the lives of Black and Indigenous women and girls, especially those who come from low-income communities. So not only do Black women make up 23% of all women living below the poverty line, but they are also facing dire conditions as it relates to the current maternal and infant mortality crisis in this nation, where the United States has the highest maternal and infant mortality rate among comparable developed countries, right? We know that Black mothers are twice as likely to experience infant mortality than white women. Black women from all across the income spectrum are dying from preventable pregnancy-related complications at 3 to 4 times the rate of white women. And this is the landscape that we are now faced with. The question that comes before us is, how do we respond? And in our reflections, right, we had been talking about how our innate reaction is to move towards some sort of action. And that will be the case and is on the horizon. But I believe that as the church, we must provide space for lament, right? We must provide space for a holistic processing. And I observe, right, in my experiences working within local churches, that we are not always so quick to stay in this space of lament, right? Because it is something that is uncomfortable. Oftentimes it is painful. Oftentimes we wonder if we are able to go from lament to rejoicing. But in the premise of this conversation, right, looking towards hope, I think of, her name is Cole Arthur Riley, who wrote the book, This Here Flesh. And in her conversation on lament, she reflects in lament not being anti-hope, but lament being a form of hope itself. She says that our hope can be only as deep as our lament, and our lament as deep as our hope. So what does this look like, right? I think that we are to look at it both personally and collectively. Personally, I think even though we knew that this decision was on the horizon, and because of the Supreme Court leak that happened a few weeks before the actual ruling itself, we could anticipate the direction, right, that our nation was going. I think for some, Friday was a deeply emotional day. I think for some, there was a need to take a step back and to really reflect on what this meant for women and those who are of childbearing age, what this meant for them personally. And so I think that it is important for us, one, to give ourselves permission to be gracious and to be gentle with ourselves, to give ourselves the space to exhale and to experience emotions as they come, right? Not all the times are we able to do that. And then collectively, I think what lament looks like for us in the church, right? How can we provide spaces within the life of the church to talk about these issues, is looking at the current structures that we have in the church and asking ourselves, pushing ourselves to be intentional about finding spaces for women and for girls to process, right? Is it possible within the preaching moment to name what has happened? Is it possible to include reflection about the experiences and the conditions that women and girls face on a daily basis? Is it possible to discuss the human conditions as it relates to gender justice within our Bible studies and within our prayer groups? Is it possible to provide space, whether it be before worship on Sundays or sometime during the week, where people might come to process their feelings and their emotions? I think that that is our immediate step. And that is my prayer, right? That we are able to do that as the church.
Amen. One thing that I've definitely been impressed watching you guys in action is that you move from the dimension of prayer into policy and action as it relates to our social principles, which really is our true north for our church. And maybe, Susan, you can remind us of what the social principles say about these issues that we've been talking about, the reproductive health and women's rights, racism, gun prevention, however you want to capture it. I know it's a lot to unpack, but how can we move beyond prayer with action as it relates to our social principles?
Sure. In our social principles, we have 76 statements about a whole variety of issues. And it is the responsibility of pastors and leaders in the church to preach and to teach and to promote the church's position on all of these issues. And I think that every Sunday school class, every conversation that relates to issues in the community are probably pretty much listed in the social principles. I want to highlight just a couple of things that we haven't said in a long time, but on two issues, one on the issue of racism, and the other on the issue of reproductive health. And the statement in these two cases have been in the discipline for 40 years. So these did not just happen in the past, well, since General Conference last met, which was now a long time ago. But these statements have been in the social principles since the beginning of the United Methodist Church. Racism is the combination of the power to dominate by one race over other races, and a value system that assumes that the dominant race is innately superior to others. Racism includes both personal and institutional racism. And it goes on in the paragraph to talk about the definitions of racism. Therefore, we recognize racism as sin and affirm the ultimate and temporal worth of all persons. We rejoice in the gifts that the particular ethnic histories and cultures bring to our total life, and we commit as the church to move beyond symbolic expressions and representative models that do not challenge unjust systems of power and access. So that statement now, in light of what Kendall and Holly talked about in terms of gun violence, and then moving it into the area of reproductive health. The church's position on reproductive health and abortion has been a very strong statement for 40 years with a few tweaks, but not very many. I will not read the whole thing because it is a long statement, but it is paragraph 161H, not HK. And I would urge you to look at it. And it's also on our website. So www.umcjustice.org, you can find all the statements of the social principles, which really need to be taught and preached and discussed and listened to and understood by United Methodists and in our ecumenical relationships. This statement says, the beginning of life and the ending of life are the God-given boundaries of human existence. While individuals have always had some degree over when they die, they now have the awesome power to determine when and even whether new individuals should be born. Our belief is in the sanctity of unborn life, which makes us reluctant to approve abortion. But we are equally bound to respect the sacredness of the life and well-being of the mother and the unborn child. We recognize tragic conflicts of life with life that may justify abortion, and in such cases, we support the legal option of abortion under proper medical procedures by certified medical providers. And we support parental, guardian, and other responsible adult notification and consent before abortions can be performed on girls who have not reached the legal age. We cannot affirm abortion as an acceptable means of birth control, and we unconditionally reject it as a means of gender selection or eugenics. And we oppose the use of late-term abortion known as dilation and extraction. It goes on, and then it ends with, we call all Christians to a searching and prayerful inquiry into the sorts of conditions that may cause them to consider abortion. We trust God to provide guidance, wisdom, and discernment to those facing an unintended pregnancy. And it goes on and talks about that we are mourn and are committed to promoting high abortion rates and other things in that paragraph. But I would really strongly urge that not only do we issue statements, which are important, but that we engage in honest conversation and listening in our church communities.
Thank you, Susan, for that direct exposition. I think it was really interesting and connectional, I think, for us as United Methodists. We have one more question that I want to pose, and then we're going to open it up to your questions. So after I ask this question, maybe you can begin to chat us your questions that if we have time, I'll be more than happy to read and get the panel or get our folks to answer. This one's for you, Holly. While these important social issues continue to unfold in the United States, we cannot forget ongoing conflicts happening around the world, particularly what is our role as United Methodists in responding to conflict in Ukraine.
Thanks, Jeff. I think when we talk about the conflict in Ukraine, we need to put it in perspective. I want to just take a minute to situate that kind of in how it began, where it is, and also how it exists in a larger world, because we all watched Russian land forces invade the sovereign country of Ukraine in February of this year. But that was not the start of the conflict. This has been a long, ongoing conflict. There were Russian forces in southeastern Ukraine for a long time, for years. And the conflict in Ukraine, while it has our attention and it is all over our television screens, it is not the only war happening worldwide. There are a lot of people suffering in a lot of corners of this world. And my hope is that in our discussion of the conflict in Ukraine today, that can kind of open our eyes to the ways that war impacts people and the need for peace in our world in a broader way. So I would just I'm mindful of time. I'm going to mention just a few global impacts of the war in Ukraine, and then I want to introduce another perspective on this issue. As we can all recognize, the issue in Ukraine is settling into a long-term conflict. This doesn't show any sign of ending soon. And there are three major ways that this is impacting the world, in addition to the severe violence and just loss of life that's happening in the Ukraine. We also see this large refugee crisis that is ongoing and that you'll hear a little bit more about in a moment. We see the reemergence of nuclear threats in a way that we haven't really seen in the past few decades, which I think is a reminder to us of the continued importance of doing nuclear disarmament work, of re-engaging in those international treaties and international conversations, like with renewed seriousness, because those weapons continue to be a threat as long as they continue to exist in our world. And then the third point that I would raise would be the concerns about food security. With Ukraine unable to export grain, we are reminded how interconnected we are in this world and how violence in this world hurts us emotionally, it hurts us spiritually, but it also hurts us physically because we are also interconnected. And so when we're looking at the countries that are going to suffer the most from the inability to get that grain, we're looking at countries mostly in the Middle East and in Africa, and we're talking about countries like Ethiopia and the Sudan that are already facing severe food insecurity, and the addition of this food crisis on top of the problems that are already there is just creating a crisis situation on a scale that that is really concerning. So I think we need to continue to pay attention to those three things. So I want to take this opportunity to introduce another perspective. We have some remarks from our GBCS board member, Reverend Timon, and I want to give an opportunity for us to listen to what he has to say.
Dear brothers and sisters, My name is Timon. I'm an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church of South Germany. Thank you for letting me share thoughts on the war in the Ukraine from a European, especially German, point of view. What I say might not be representative for my church. The borders of Ukraine and Germany are about 450 miles apart. There are two countries in between. The place where I live, Karlsruhe, is about 1,000 miles from Kiev, Ukraine's capital. We don't feel an actual threat of war for Germany or other Western European countries. But nobody knows where this war will lead to. While I speak here, I know my life is safe. The lives of many thousands in the Ukraine are not. What can I say about activating hope through advocacy? You might know that more than 7 million people left the Ukraine. Most of them found refuge in direct neighboring countries. Only about 750,000 of them came to Germany. More than 4 million made it to Poland. In most cases, people throughout Europe are willing to welcome these refugees. The support is big. The churches do not play a special role in this support, but you find cooperations of different volunteers, organizations, including churches and local authorities. We try to offer them safe places. We will see how long this willingness will endure when the war drags on, but it probably will. What makes me uneasy in Germany is how fast our politicians and also journalists turned to an uncritical support to bringing weapons into the Ukraine. Don't get me wrong. The Ukrainian people have the right to defend themselves, to defend their autonomy, their independence, and of course their lives. Nothing justifies Putin's aggression. In Germany, after the Second World War, we used to not export weapons into conflict areas. This was a political principle. The weapon industry made it and managed to bypass this too often. But the basic line, the official basic line was clear: no weapons into conflict areas. But now suddenly politicians get under pressure, even by journalists, not only by the opposition, if they don't swap sides fast enough. But bringing weapons to the Ukraine means the war takes longer, more people will die on both sides. Weapons might help save lives, but they definitely take lives. So we have to admit and we have to confess, whether we send weapons to the Ukraine or not, we are guilty. We are guilty of bringing death to people. But did you know there are deserters in the Russian and Belarus armies, as well as in the Ukrainian army? Church and Peace is a European ecumenical network. They said these days about nonviolence: it is not a matter of telling the people in Ukraine and other conflict areas of the world how to defend themselves, nor is it a matter of leaving them alone. Nonviolence, especially in view of the extent of open violence, in view of the threat of escalation, in view of the dangerous latent or open conflicts worldwide, opens up an alternative perspective for a future in security for all on our endangered planet. It does not seem newsworthy so far that people in the past and present have practiced and are practicing bravery other than with a weapon, including in Ukraine and even Russia. Nonviolence is first and foremost an attitude. It respects the humanity of every human being, including the opponent. It is linked to courage, skills, creativity, and activity. Nonviolence is not passivity, on the contrary. But it has to be learned. And for that, more than ever, an investment in people and skills is needed, at least as much as has been invested in weapons. This requires a radical rethinking instead of increasing armament. I know I say this living in a safe place. It's not about telling people under threat how they should act. It is about raising awareness that there are more options of support than sending weapons or not sending weapons. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to share these thoughts with you, as it made myself reflect and rethink my own view. May God change the hearts of people to pursuing peace instead of pursuing power. Thank you, and shalom.
Thank you, Holly, for sharing that video with us. That was powerful. Hearing everything that you just heard and knowing what you know, where do you find the hope in this international work?
So I actually see several areas of hope in response to this crisis. As I mentioned before, our focus on Ukraine opens our eyes to the real horrors of war. And I think the first step in tackling any problem is to properly see it and properly identify it. And we have opened conversations about refugees, I think, in a way that we did not before. I think we are having conversations about food security in a new way. I think we are talking about how we are all interconnected. And I am hopeful that we can take this new understanding and also apply it to the other areas in the world that are under occupation or in conflict. I'm also really inspired. I see a lot of hope in the resiliency of the Ukrainian people. They have a history of responding to violence and intimidation with dignity, and a history of interfaith public witness in their country in the face of threats. And so I see a lot of hope in their responses. And then one of the most wonderful parts about being new at GBCS is I see a lot of hope in the United Methodists that I meet. So there are pockets of United Methodists in unexpected places all over the world who have been doing this work for decades, some of them longer than I've been alive. And it is a great joy for me to be able to meet those people, to get to know them, to learn from them. I'm also inspired by young United Methodists I've met. Our high school students and college students and young adults have been steeped in activism from a young age, and we have got some power players on the horizon. And so I'm very inspired by the work that United Methodists are already doing to put their faith in action. And I hope that we at GBCS can be a point of connection for them and a way to support their efforts and encourage them in their work. On the practical front, there are some ways that people can get plugged in. Make sure they're connected with us. They're signed up for our alerts and our various groups. Reach out to us if you need information, if you need help finding a local organization involved in this type of work. And then I also want to highlight, UMCOR is handling the humanitarian response related to Ukraine on behalf of the United Methodist Church. There's two ways to give to UMCOR that benefit Ukraine. The first is to donate to the humanitarian efforts. So that money goes to medical supplies and food for folks in the country and also for refugees that have left. The second way to donate is to donate to the fund that funds the operation of the United Methodist churches in Ukraine, which are in need of operational support to continue their operations right now.
Excellent. Thank you, Holly. Well, we have a few minutes for questions. Did you all want to offer any more commentary around hope? You said a lot and it's been very enlightening. Is there any more comments before we get into the Q&A?
Yeah, I'll go really quickly. I think as it relates to where we are in this current landscape of reproductive health, for me, I have been inspired by the Council of Bishops released a statement as well. And I was really happy to see that in addition to the statement that we released as the Global Board of Church and Society, and then also the statement released by the Commission, General Commission on the Status and Role of Women, that there was a recognition that we as the United Methodist Church house a spectrum of opinions on reproductive health, that we are not monolithic, and that is as it should be. What I can respect and appreciate from the sort of general understanding that I got was that even though we have a difference of opinion, there is still a call to treat women as though they should be treated. And I think that as this has happened, this has led us to ask questions that reveal some of the greater conditions that women are experiencing, that we have now this sense of urgency to ask the question of how are our women and our girls doing? And not only to ask that question, but to examine ways that we might do a better job in responding. To know that we are now in this place to say that to the young girl or to the young woman who has experienced an abortion, but has become ostracized by her community, we're now in a place to say that we will do better by you. And even beyond that, to women and girls who stand on the margins and often go unseen by conversations that we are not having within the faith community, we are now in this space to say that we will do better. And I do think that that is the hope, at least for me in this moment, of there is potential to ask the needed questions, and there is potential to do a better job at responding.
Thank you. Thank you, Camille. We have probably time for maybe one or two questions. Here is a very interesting question. I think, Susan, you'll want to take a crack at this. David says he's really impressed with the Justice Talks forums, but he's worried this is still another silo. We're talking to United Methodists. How do we speak outside of our silo? And maybe, Susan, you can talk about our engagement around the United Nations, the ecumenical connections, Congress, White House, the UMC influence that's outside of UMC family.
Sure, I really appreciate getting to respond to that question. A lot of our work, both in Washington and in New York and in many parts of the world, really is dependent upon our ecumenical partners and relationships. And I've seen some of the, I've been kind of watching the chat a little bit and seen some of the comments from Nigeria and about Burundi and Pakistan and Ethiopia. And we know about Yemen and Syria. And our work, both on war and peace and on violence and on women, is in collaboration with other organizations. We have very strong partnerships in Washington, so that when the gun bill was being passed in Congress, we were signing on to that with other faith partners. And so our voices were really accelerated and in terms of helping push that forward. And your voices are extremely, extremely important, so that when we put out action alerts about things that are coming up in Congress, your response makes a huge difference. One of our board members contacted Senator Cornyn, and it made a huge difference. Not just that one call, but I'm sure there were thousands. But that was a really important connection to make. And so doing the part at the local and state level is really important, and keeping your relationships with ecumenical and faith partners alive and active, and also for us to keep our ecumenical and faith partnerships really activated and alive, really accentuates our voice in places where we need that to happen. So I really appreciate that. And in many ways, we are siloed, but in many other ways, we're not. And so our conversations with our Lutheran brothers and sisters, our Presbyterians, Catholic Relief Services, many other faith organizations are really standing together to address all of these issues that we've highlighted today.
Thank you. We have run out of time. Went by so fast. Well, that's it for the edition of Justice Talks. We'll respond to the questions in our chat directly if we can. We are going to send you a link of this event if you'd like to review it again. And in addition, this event and other recordings of our previous Justice Talk conversations can be found on YouTube page at UMC Justice. Thanks to Susan, Tillman, Holly, Camille, Kendall, and our producer Amber for this edition of Justice Talks, Activating Hope Through Advocacy. And thanks to all of you who joined us today. Susan, I'd like to offer you the final word to close out our program.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. And thank you, dear colleagues, for the work that you put into this and the work that you continue to do. I would like to say a special word of thanks to Timon for raising very important ethical questions, because the questions that we've all raised as ethical questions are really interesting questions that we need to continue to talk about. And so I hope we can continue to have those conversations. The work of nonviolence is very, very important at every level of the world. And we need to continue to promote a nonviolent way of being in the world. In this, I was reminded of one of the stories that I really like of Easter, remembering that we are resurrection people. And in the face of Good Friday violence and horror and terror and death, Sunday morning does come. And on that Sunday morning, a very strange thing happened. You will remember that Mary went to the tomb, and Mary went to the tomb expecting to find death. And there she found life. Life came to her in the midst of the horror and the terror and the death of that moment. And life does come to us, even in the very moment of death and lamentation. So life will come to us, and we will be known and called by name as we continue to be people of faith walking into the world together. Thank you so much.